It is the summer of 1680. The desert air above what is now New Mexico sits thick and still, baking the red earth until it cracks. For nearly a century, the Pueblo people have endured Spanish colonial rule, forced labor, forced conversion, priests burning their sacred objects in public fires, elders dragged away in chains for practicing the religion their ancestors carried for thousands of years. And then, on the 10th of August, a single man rides from Pueblo to Pueblo with a message knotted into a cord. Each knot is a day. When the last knot is reached, the uprising begins. His name is Pope, and what he sets in motion will drive the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 full years, making the Pueblo Revolt the single most successful indigenous resistance action in the history of North America. But here is the part that almost nobody knows, almost nobody talks about. The version of Native American history most of us carry in our heads has no room for a moment like this. No room for strategy. No room for leadership. No room for a calculated, organized military and political campaign launched by people the history books quietly filed away as passive victims, wandering figures in feathered headdresses, relics of a world that simply faded when Europeans arrived. That version of history is not just incomplete, it is a fabrication. And today we are going to take it apart, piece by piece. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we are diving into one of the most misrepresented stories in American history, the true world of Native Americans before, during, and after European contact. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the kind of content we do every single week. No softened edges, no comfortable mythology, just the real story. Let's get into it. Here's a number that will recalibrate everything you think you know. In 1492, when Columbus's ships crossed the Atlantic, scholars estimate there were somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people living in the Americas. Some estimates go higher. At least 2,000 distinct languages were spoken across the continent. 2,000. By comparison, all of Europe in the same period had perhaps 70 million people, speaking maybe 250 languages. The Americas were not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were one of the most densely populated, linguistically diverse, and culturally sophisticated regions on the planet. So why does popular culture still give us the image of a few scattered tribes huddled in tipis on a vast empty plain? That image was built deliberately, and it was built because an empty land is a land that needs no justification to take. But before we get into how that myth was manufactured, I need to tell you about a city, because the moment I describe this city, your entire mental picture of pre-colonial North America is going to shift. Stand on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River in what is now Illinois. The year is approximately 1 to 1000 CE. Before you, stretching across the floodplain, is a city of roughly 15,000 to 20,000 people. It has a central plaza, larger than any Roman forum. At its heart rises a flat-topped earthen pyramid so massive that it contains more raw material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its peak stands a building that may have served as a palace, a temple, or both. This is Cahokia, and it was, at its height, one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London at the same time in history. Cahokia was a trading hub connected to networks that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians, all of it flowing through this city, governed by a stratified political system with a ruling class, a merchant class, and a labor force managing agricultural outputs that fed tens of thousands. When European settlers began moving through the Midwest centuries later, they stumbled across these mounds and genuinely could not believe indigenous people had built them. They invented theories about a lost race of white giants. They called it the work of Vikings, Phoenicians, Egyptians, anyone but the people who had actually lived there. That tells you something important. It tells you the myth of primitive, wandering Indians was so deeply embedded that even physical, undeniable, monumental evidence could not shake it. Now, here is the question I want you to hold on to for the next few minutes. If the pre-contact civilizations of North America were this sophisticated, this organized, this capable of building and governing cities, what does that tell us about the process of colonization? Because we were taught that European settlers arrived in a wilderness and built something from nothing. The real story is far more complicated and far darker. Stay with me. Let's talk about the diversity problem, and I mean that in the most literal sense. Most people still think of Native Americans as a single group, one culture, one aesthetic, one story. The reality is closer to comparing a Norwegian Viking to a Byzantine Greek and calling them the same people because they both lived in the same century. Over 500 federally recognized tribes exist in the United States alone, each one with its own language, its own governance structure, its own spiritual tradition, its own agricultural practice or hunting culture, its own architecture, its own clothing, its own history. The Navajo of the Southwest built sophisticated irrigation systems and wove textiles of extraordinary complexity. The Haudenosaunee, known to many as the Iroquois Confederacy, developed a democratic governance model so advanced that several historians and political scientists argue it directly influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. The Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest built massive cedar longhouses and maintained hereditary clan systems with an intricate oral legal tradition. The Plains tribes, those most associated in the popular imagination with the teepee and the feathered warbonnet, were themselves enormously varied, and many of them only adopted the nomadic buffalo hunting lifestyle after the introduction of the horse by Spanish settlers in the 17th century. That last detail is worth pausing on. The horse, that iconic image of the mounted plains warrior silhouetted against the sunset, is real, but it is only a few hundred years old. Before European contact, tribes across the plains had entirely different ways of life. They adapted, they innovated, they incorporated a new technology and built something extraordinary with it in under a century. That is not passivity, that is cultural genius. And yet, the monolith persists. Every October, we still debate a holiday named after the man who, by his own journal, described the people he encountered as gentle, intelligent, and well-suited to servitude. Columbus did not discover a primitive world. He collided with a complex one. Let me ask you this. When you picture a Native American in your mind right now, what do you see? I want you to hold that image, because by the end of this video, I think it is going to look very different. Here is another myth that dies hard. The idea that Native Americans were passive victims of colonization, swept away by forces beyond their understanding or control, helpless in the face of European military and technological superiority. This is not history. This is propaganda that got taught as history. From the moment European powers began pushing inland, they encountered organized, strategic, and often devastatingly effective resistance. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which I opened this video with, drove 1,200 Spanish colonists from New Mexico. The Spanish did not return for 12 years, and when they did, they returned with substantially fewer of the brutal policies that had triggered the revolt in the first place. Pope and the Pueblo leaders had negotiated a better reality through force of arms and force of will. In the 1760s, an Ottawa war leader named Pontiac organized a coalition of tribes across the Great Lakes region in a coordinated military campaign against British forts. Simultaneously, across hundreds of miles of frontier, 9 out of 12 British fortifications in the region fell in a matter of weeks. Pontiac's rebellion, as the British called it, was not a random series of skirmishes. It was a carefully planned strategic offensive that forced the British Crown to issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763, formally recognizing Indigenous territorial claims west of the Appalachians. A military campaign that produced a formal legal document of international recognition. That is not the behavior of a people incapable of political or military sophistication. Throughout the period of American expansion, tribes consistently pursued every available avenue: diplomacy, alliance, legal action, armed resistance. The Cherokee Nation went to the United States Supreme Court and won. Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling. That is not a story of Indian failure. That is a story of American lawlessness at the highest level. Even the epidemic catastrophe, the near total collapse of indigenous populations from European diseases like smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza, was not a passive experience. Communities reorganized. Survivors formed new coalitions. Spiritual and cultural knowledge was transmitted under conditions of unimaginable loss. The fact that hundreds of tribal nations survived at all, that languages and ceremonies and governance structures persisted through everything the colonial period threw at them, represents one of the most remarkable acts of collective endurance in human history. And yet the curriculum in most American schools still frames this period as inevitable, as if the outcome was written by nature rather than chosen by policy. I want to take a breath here and ask you something directly. If you grew up learning that Native Americans simply faded out of history, that they were a tragic but passive chapter, does knowing what you know now change anything for you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely read them, and I think this is one of those conversations that matters. Now let's address the stereotype that probably does the most quiet daily damage. The idea that Native Americans exist only in the past tense. Drive through any major American city, and you will pass Native Americans who are lawyers, engineers, writers, doctors, athletes, musicians, filmmakers, and elected officials. There are currently 4 Native Americans serving in the United States Congress. The sculptor who designed the 3 servicemen statue at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is Native American. The code talkers of World War II, Navajo men whose language formed an unbreakable military cipher, helped secure Allied victory in the Pacific. They were not relics, they were veterans, and many of them came home from that war to a country that would not let them vote. The narrative of extinction is not just historically wrong. It is actively harmful to communities working to maintain their languages, their ceremonial practices, their sovereignty, and their presence in contemporary life. When the dominant culture insists on seeing you only through a historical lens, it erases everything you are doing right now. Consider this: there are currently over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Tribal nations operate their own governments, their own courts, their own schools, their own healthcare systems. Some manage natural resources across millions of acres of land. Others have become significant economic actors in regional and national markets. Tribal gaming, which often gets reduced to a punchline about casino profits, was for many communities the first meaningful economic development opportunity made available after generations of federally enforced poverty. And speaking of poverty, let's deal with one of the most stubborn and cruel myths in the whole conversation. The idea that Native Americans are somehow living well off, generous, government support, showered with benefits the rest of the population does not receive. The data is unambiguous, and it is devastating. By nearly every measurable indicator, Native American communities face the most severe socioeconomic conditions of any demographic in the United States. The highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of food insecurity, among the lowest rates of educational attainment and healthcare access. Life expectancy on many reservations remains below the national average by years, sometimes by decades. The Indian Health Service, the federal agency responsible for delivering health care to roughly 2.6 million Native Americans, has been chronically underfunded for most of its existence. In the years before recent increases, federal spending on Native American health care per person was among the lowest of any federally managed population, far below what was spent on federal prisoners. Read that sentence again. The descendants of people whose land became the foundation of the American economy received less health care funding per capita than incarcerated Americans. This is not a system of generous handouts. What federal programs for Native Americans represent, legally and historically, are treaty obligations. When tribal nations signed treaties, ceding tens of millions of acres of land, they received formal promises in return. Promises of health care, promises of education, promises of protection. Those promises are debts. Treating them as charity gets the entire relationship exactly backwards. Here is the open question I want you to sit with heading into the final section of this video. If the government routinely underfunds its legal treaty obligations to the original inhabitants of the continent, and if the history taught in schools systematically understates the sophistication, agency, and endurance of those people, who benefits from that arrangement? I will leave that one in the comments section too, because we are getting to the part of this story that ties everything together. The myths we have spent this entire video examining were not accidents. They did not arise from simple ignorance or careless storytelling, though both played a role. Many of them were constructed with purpose. An uninhabited wilderness requires no moral reckoning to occupy. A primitive, vanishing people requires no treaty to displace. A passive victim leaves no philosophical challenge to a national story built on liberty and justice. The teepee and the feathered headdress became the default visual shorthand for all Native Americans, not because they were universal, but because they were different enough to mark a clear boundary between us and them, and simple enough to render in a dime novel illustration or a Hollywood poster. The complexity of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy does not fit on a movie poster. The agricultural engineering of the ancestral Puebloans does not fit into a Western narrative where one side represents civilization. So, those things got left out. And the cost of that omission has been paid, generation after generation, by real people, by children in schools where their entire civilization is compressed into a single Thanksgiving lesson, by communities whose languages have fewer than 10 living speakers because of decades of federal boarding school policy that punished children for speaking the tongue their grandparents gave them, by elders who carry knowledge that has no institutional support for transmission. But here is where this story refuses to end in tragedy. Because the resistance that Pope organized in 1680 did not end, it transformed. It adapted to every new terrain it encountered. Today it looks like the Standing Rock protests, where thousands of people from dozens of tribal nations and beyond stood in the path of an oil pipeline running through treaty land and sacred water sources. It looks like the Native American Rights Fund filing litigation in federal courts to reclaim hunting and fishing rights guaranteed by treaties signed centuries ago. It looks like language revitalization programs, recording the voices of elders, building apps, writing dictionaries, teaching children to speak words that were nearly silenced forever. It looks like Indigenous filmmakers making movies about their own communities, on their own terms, in their own languages. It looks like tribal colleges producing engineers and scientists and historians. It looks like a generation of young Native Americans who know the full story, who are not waiting for anyone's permission to tell it. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 succeeded because Pope understood something fundamental. The most powerful weapon the colonizers had was not the horse, or the gun, or the cross. It was the story they told about the people they were displacing, a story that made those people smaller, simpler, and less consequential than they actually were. Every time that story gets corrected, every time the real scale and sophistication and endurance of Native American civilizations gets put back into the conversation, it is an act of the same defiant intelligence that knotted a cord in the summer of 1680 and rode from Pueblo to Pueblo with a message the Spanish never saw coming. And so we come back to the image I asked you to hold at the beginning of this video. Whatever picture was in your head when I said the words Native Americans, I hope it is more complicated now. I hope it includes Cahokia rising out of the Mississippi floodplain. I hope it includes Pope planning a coordinated revolt across hundreds of miles of high desert. I hope it includes a Haudenosaunee diplomat arguing constitutional theory, a Navajo code talker running through jungle heat with a message no enemy cryptographer could crack, a tribal court judge issuing a ruling in a sovereignty case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. I hope it includes a kid in a reservation school in 2024 learning to say words in a language her great-grandmother was punished for speaking. Because all of that is the same story, and it is not finished. That is it for today on Frontier Uncensored. If this video shifted something in the way you see this history, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week we go into the stories that got buried, distorted, or just never told properly in the first place. And if you have a connection to any of this, a family story, a correction, a perspective I missed, I want to hear it. The comments are open. I mean that. I am Dustin. This is Frontier Uncensored.